At 61, James Hetfield is no longer the angry young musician trying to conquer the world. He has survived addiction, fame, personal loss, and decades of life under a spotlight that never seemed to dim. But there is one chapter of his story that fans have never stopped talking about. It is a story that begins long before sold-out stadiums, before platinum records, and before Metallica became one of the biggest bands in music history. It begins with another young musician whose name remains permanently tied to Metallica's origin story, Dave Mustaine. For more than 40 years, the relationship between Hetfield and Mustaine has been discussed, debated, and often exaggerated. Fans have chosen sides. Journalists have fueled headlines. Entire generations of metal listeners have argued over who was right, who was wrong, and what might have happened if history had taken a different path. Yet as both men have grown older, the story has become less about rivalry and more about something deeper. It has become a story about ambition, regret, pride, and the complicated bond between two people who helped shape an entire genre. When Metallica first came together in the early 1980s, nobody involved could have imagined the legacy they would create. They were young, hungry, and obsessed with making music louder, faster, and heavier than almost anything around them. Hetfield and Lars Ulrich had the vision, but when Mustaine entered the picture, he brought something explosive. His guitar playing was aggressive, technical, and unpredictable. Even in those early days, his influence on the band's sound was impossible to ignore. Many of the ideas that helped define early Metallica carried traces of Mustaine's creativity and intensity. But talent alone does not guarantee harmony. The same fire that made Mustaine such a compelling musician also created tension. Stories from those years describe a band constantly walking a tightrope between creative excitement and personal conflict. The environment was chaotic. Tempers flared. Mistakes piled up. What began as a promising partnership slowly became increasingly difficult to sustain. Then came the moment that would change heavy metal history. In 1983, Mustaine was removed from Metallica. The decision was made and he was sent away. For many fans, this has always been the defining moment in the story. Created two paths. One would lead to Metallica becoming a global phenomenon. The other would lead Mustaine toward a mission that seemed fueled by equal parts determination and heartbreak. Most people know what happened next. Rather than disappearing, Mustaine transformed his frustration into motivation. He founded Megadeth and threw himself into building something that could stand alongside the band that had left him behind. He wasn't interested in being remembered as a former Metallica member. He wanted to create a legacy of his own. And that is exactly what he did. The rise of Megadeth was not some footnote in Metallica's story. It became one of the greatest comeback stories in rock history. Album after album established Mustaine as a force in his own right. His songwriting became sharper. His musicianship became more ambitious. His reputation as one of metal's most gifted guitarists only grew stronger. What began as a response to rejection evolved into a career that earned respect throughout the music world. Yet success did not erase the past. Even as Megadeth climbed higher, comparisons followed everywhere. Every new release seemed to reignite old debates. Fans analyzed riffs, songwriting credits, and early recordings. Journalists repeatedly returned to the same question. Who really deserved credit for the foundation of Metallica? The conversation never seemed to end. What made the situation fascinating was how differently the two men responded. Mustaine often spoke openly about the past. He expressed frustration. He challenged narratives he believed were unfair. He reminded audiences that he had been there at the beginning. Whether fans agreed with him or not, there was never any doubt about how deeply those events affected him. Hetfield, on the other hand, chose a different path. Instead of responding publicly, he focused on Metallica. While the rivalry dominated headlines, he poured his energy into building something larger than the conflict itself. Metallica evolved rapidly during the mid-1980s. Albums like Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets pushed the band's sound forward and established them as leaders of the genre. The music became bigger, more sophisticated, and more ambitious. Rather than fighting with words, Hetfield seemed determined to answer every challenge through the work itself. That approach helped shape the image many fans associate with him today. While Mustaine often externalized his emotions, Hetfield tended to internalize them. The result was a fascinating contrast. One man confronted the past directly. The other seemed determined to outrun it. As the years passed, both bands became giants. Metallica expanded beyond thrash metal and reached an audience far larger than anyone could have predicted. Albums like And Justice for All and Metallica transformed them into a global phenomenon. Some fans celebrated the evolution, others criticized it, but regardless of opinion, the results were impossible to ignore. Metallica had become one of the biggest bands on the planet. Megadeth followed a different path. The band remained deeply connected to the technical, aggressive spirit that had always defined Mustaine's vision. Albums such as Peace Sells, But Who's Buying? Helped establish Megadeth as one of the most respected names in metal. They were no longer viewed simply as Metallica's rival. They were a powerhouse in their own right. But even after decades of success, neither man could completely escape the shadow of their shared history. The most revealing moment came years later. In 2004, Metallica released the documentary Metallica, Some Kind of Monster. The film was intended to document the band's internal struggles, but it unexpectedly produced one of the most emotional moments in rock documentary history. For the first time in decades, Hetfield and Mustaine sat down together and confronted the past face to face. What made that conversation so powerful was its honesty. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic confrontations. Instead, there were two older men discussing wounds that had never fully healed. Mustaine spoke openly about feeling discarded and unappreciated. Hetfield listened and explained the difficult circumstances surrounding the decision. The conversation revealed something fans had rarely seen before: vulnerability. For years, the rivalry had been reduced to headlines and fan arguments. But that meeting showed a different reality. Beneath the mythology were real people carrying real emotions. Mustaine wasn't simply angry. Hetfield wasn't simply dismissive. The situation was far more complicated than decades of media narratives had suggested. The meeting did not magically solve everything. There was no perfect reconciliation, no dramatic ending that erased years of tension. In some ways, the conversation created as many questions as answers. Yet it changed the way many fans viewed the relationship. Instead of seeing two rivals locked in permanent conflict, people saw two individuals wrestling with the consequences of choices made when they were young. As the years continued, subtle changes became noticeable. Hetfield occasionally spoke about Mustaine with greater openness. He acknowledged the talent that Mustaine brought to early Metallica and recognized his role in the band's foundation. Mustaine, while still willing to criticize aspects of the past, also appeared increasingly willing to discuss the relationship with greater nuance. It was not full peace, but it was progress. By the time both bands appeared together during events associated with the Big Four concerts, fans witnessed something that once seemed impossible. Metallica and Megadeth sharing stages. Audiences celebrating both bands rather than choosing sides. The old divisions that had once felt so important began to soften. That doesn't mean the fascination disappeared. Even today, fans continue asking the same question. What if Mustaine had never been removed from Metallica? What if the original chemistry had survived? What if the partnership had continued? It is one of music's great unanswered questions. Yet perhaps the more interesting answer is the one history actually delivered. Because the split created two legendary bands instead of one. Without that separation, there might never have been Megadeth. Without the pressure of competition, Metallica may not have evolved in exactly the same way. The rivalry, painful as it was, pushed both sides to achieve extraordinary things. In a strange way, the conflict helped fuel creativity. At 61, Hetfield seems to understand that reality better than ever. Age changes perspective. The battles that once seemed all-consuming begin to look different. Old enemies become fellow survivors. Old arguments lose some of their power. What remains is the recognition of shared history. And perhaps that is why discussions about Mustaine feel different today than they did 20 years ago. Instead of focusing on blame, Hetfield increasingly seems focused on understanding. Instead of reliving every disagreement, he appears more willing to acknowledge the complexity of the story. That doesn't mean every issue has been resolved. It doesn't mean every wound has healed. But it does suggest that time has created space for reflection. In the end, the story of James Hetfield and Dave Mustaine is not really about a feud. It is about two ambitious young musicians whose lives changed forever after a single decision. It is about success achieved through different paths. It is about the burden of history and the challenge of moving beyond it. Most importantly, it is about legacy. Because when fans look back at heavy metal history, they no longer see only a firing, a rivalry, or a decades-long disagreement. They see two artists who helped shape an entire genre. Two bands whose music inspired millions. Two careers that became permanently linked, not because one defeated the other, but because both succeeded. And that may be the most remarkable part of the story. The chapter that once seemed defined by bitterness has gradually transformed into something else entirely. A reminder that even the deepest divisions can evolve with time. A reminder that success doesn't always erase pain, but it can give that pain meaning. For decades, fans wanted a winner. What history ultimately gave them was something much more interesting. It gave them both.